Meg Ellery had learned to be invisible long before she ever set foot at Blackwater House, and invisibility, she had come to understand, was its own peculiar kind of freedom. So when she saw Labor collapse into the freezing surf during the harbor repairs, while the fine guests above sipped claret and called it entertainment, she didn't think about her reputation. She waded into the water. She didn't know she was pulling the Duke of Ravensmere out of the tide by his collar. The storm that had torn through the Cornish coast in March of 1817 had taken with it 3 fishing boats, half the old stone harbor wall, and the livelihood of nearly every family in the small village below Blackwater House. Margaret Ellery, Meg, to the handful of people who bothered to use a given name at all, had watched the wreckage from her narrow window in the servants' wing for a full week before Lady Prudence Ashworth, her aunt by marriage and reluctant benefactor, finally permitted her downstairs to resume her duties as companion and unpaid secretary. Meg was 26 years old, playing in the particular way that made drawing rooms forget she existed the moment she entered them, and entirely without fortune since her father's shipping investments had collapsed along with half of England's merchant fleet 6 years earlier. She had come to live under her aunt's roof not out of affection but out of arithmetic. Lady Prudence needed someone to manage her correspondence and her accounts who would work for room, board, and the barest pretense of family obligation, and Meg had needed somewhere to exist that wasn't the street. She remembered, with a clarity that still occasionally stole her breath at inconvenient moments, the particular indignity of that first winter after her father's death, watching bailiffs carry away the modest furnishings of the only home she had ever known, understanding for the first time in her sheltered young life that a woman without fortune or family connection existed in society roughly the way furniture did, useful only insofar as she served some practical purpose, and easily discarded. The moment she ceased to, Lady Prudence's offer of a home had felt, at the time, like salvation. It had taken Meg rather longer to understand it was merely a different, more comfortable shade of the same bleak arithmetic, and longer still to make her peace with a particular freedom that came from having nothing left to lose in the eyes of people who had never valued her presence to begin with. Blackwater House sat on a windswept headland above the village harbor, a grand, aging pile of grey stone that had belonged, until 3 months earlier, to a distant and thoroughly disinterested duke who had never once visited it in Meg's memory. The old Duke of Ravensmere had died in London that winter, and his heir, a nephew nobody in the village had ever laid eyes on, had inherited the title, the house, and, according to the estate's harbour master, a coastal community currently drowning under the weight of storm damage nobody in London seemed inclined to pay for. They say the new Duke is a recluse, Lady Prudence remarked one evening. Over a supper Meg had not been invited to share but had been required to serve notes through during. Mr. Price writes that His Grace has authorized only the barest minimum for repairs. One can hardly blame the man. Ravensmere is the least fashionable of his 5 properties, I understand, and this harbour business is dreadfully expensive. Meg said nothing, though she had spent that very afternoon in the village, delivering what little charity her aunt could be persuaded to spare, and had seen with her own eyes exactly what the barest minimum meant in practice. Families sleeping in half-collapsed cottages, fishermen with no boats and no wages, and a harbour wall still gaping open to the sea like a wound nobody had bothered to close. It was Silas Price, the estate's harbour master, who ran what repair efforts existed, and Meg had disliked him from her very first encounter with the man, a broad, florid figure who spoke of the villagers suffering with the detached irritation of a man discussing a delayed shipment rather than starving families. Price had hired a rough crew of de labours to rebuild the stone seawall, paying them a pittance and working them from dawn past dusk in conditions a retreating winter had made genuinely dangerous, all while assuring Lady Prudence's dinner guests, when they gathered on the headland to watch the work with the idle curiosity of people observing an exotic spectacle, that everything proceeded exactly as His Grace in London had instructed. Meg first noticed the dark-haired Labor on her second morning back among the household, watching from the cliff path as she made her way down toward the village with a basket of mended linen for the harbor master's wife. He worked at the water's edge, hauling dressed stone into place with a controlled, furious efficiency that set him apart from the exhausted men around him. Not stronger, precisely, though he was clearly strong, but entirely unwilling to let the work defeat him the way it had visibly begun to defeat everyone else on that crew. She thought little of it at first. Labors were labors, and Meg had learned, in her years of quiet invisibility, not to look too closely at people whose suffering she could do nothing to fix. But 3 days later, standing on the cliff path again while a bitter wind whipped in off the grey water, she watched the tide turn faster than the crew had accounted for, watched the youngest of the workers, a boy of perhaps 15, sent out onto the half-rebuilt wall to secure a rope, lose his footing on the wet stone and vanish beneath the churning surf. For one horrifying moment, nobody moved. The wind seemed to snatch every sound away except the boy's single, choked cry before the water closed over him, and Meg felt the world narrow to a single point of pure animal terror, the same helpless dread she remembered from the night the bailiffs had come for her father's furniture, the sense of watching something irreversible happen and being entirely powerless to stop it. Price, watching from his horse on the cliff above, shouted something Meg couldn't make out over the wind, his voice more irritated than alarmed, as though the boy's disappearance beneath the waves were merely an inconvenience of the day's schedule rather than a matter of life and death. And then the dark-haired labor was moving, throwing aside his tools and diving into the freezing water without a single second hesitation, disappearing beneath the waves in pursuit of the boy while the rest of the crew stood frozen at the water's edge. Meg didn't remember deciding to run. She simply found herself scrambling down the steep cliff path, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath tearing at her chest, reaching the rocky shoreline just as a laborious surfaced with a sputtering, half-conscious boy clutch against his chest, both of them battered by the surf, neither of them anywhere near the safety of dry land, the current still dragging violently at their legs. "Rope!" the labor bellowed, his voice cutting through the wind with an authority that made 3 of the other workers scramble instantly to obey, though a moment earlier they had stood paralyzed. Meg didn't wait for the rope. She waded in herself, the icy water closing around her legs like a fist, and grabbed for the boy's flailing arm the moment he came within reach, hauling with everything her slight frame could manage until 2 of the fishermen finally arrived with a rope to help drag all 3 of them back onto the rocks. The boy was alive, coughing up seawater, shivering violently but breathing. Meg knelt beside him on the freezing stone, stripping off her own woolen shawl to wrap around his shoulders despite her uncertain fury at the ruined garment, and it was only then that she looked up and found the dark-haired labor watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not gratitude, exactly, though there was some of that in it. Something closer to startled, searching recognition, as though she had done something he hadn't expected any person on this headland to be capable of. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice rough from the cold and the sea water, though something in the cadence of it struck Meg as strange, too precise, too crisply enunciated for a common labor, though she was too cold and too frightened in that moment to properly examine the thought. "So will he, if we don't get him somewhere warm," Meg said, nodding at the shivering boy. "Is there fire nearby?" "Blankets." "The harbor master's shed," one of the fishermen offered, and together they half carried the boy up the rocky beach while Price, still mounted on his horse above, shouted down demands that the men return to work immediately. Storm-soaked boy or no storm-soaked boy, the wall would not repair itself. The dark-haired labor straightened once the boy was safely settled by the shed's small fire, and turned to look up at Price with an expression that made even Meg, standing several feet away, feel a chill that had nothing to do with her sodden dress. "He nearly drowned," the labor said, his voice carrying easily up the slope despite its quiet register. "He is not going back on that wall today." "He is not going back on the wall at all if he can't do the work," Price called down, his tone carrying the particular cruelty of a man who has never once feared consequences for it. "Nor will you, if you keep telling me my business. Get back to the stone before I dock the both of you a week's wages." The laborer held Price's gaze for a long moment, and Meg watched something pass behind his dark eyes that looked, for just a flicker, less like the exhaustion of a beaten-down worker and more like a man carefully, deliberately restraining himself from something far more dangerous than argument. "His wages will be paid," the laborer said finally, turning away from Price without waiting for a response, and Meg found herself wondering, not for the first time that strange, freezing afternoon, exactly who this man actually was. The punishment for her afternoon's disobedience arrived before Meg had even finished changing out of a ruined dress. Lady Prudence, informed by a scandalized housemaid that her niece had waded into the harbor in full view of half the village to rescue a common labourer's son, summoned Meg to the drawing-room with an expression that promised a lecture Meg had heard, in various forms, for 6 long years. "You have made an absolute spectacle of yourself," Lady Prudence said, not looking up from her needlework, her voice carrying the particular icy calm she reserved for her deepest displeasure. "Wading into the sea like a fishwife, in front of Mr. Price and half his crew. Do you have any notion what this does to your reputation, Margaret? To mine, by extension, since you live under my roof." "A child nearly drowned, Aunt," Meg said, keeping her voice level though her hands, still faintly trembling from the cold, were clasped tightly behind her back. "I did not stop to consider my reputation." "That is precisely your failing," Lady Prudence said. "You never do. I have given you shelter, Margaret, out of duty to your late father, God rest him, but my patience for these displays of yours is not infinite. If you cannot conduct yourself with the dignity expected of a woman in this household, I shall have no choice but to find you a position elsewhere, a governess post, perhaps somewhere considerably less forgiving of impulsive behavior than my own table." Meg said nothing further, understanding by now that agreement, however insincere, was the fastest route out of her aunt's presence, and retreated to her small room in the servants' wing to sit by her narrow window and watch the last grey light fade over the water, thinking of the strange, dark-haired laborer and the odd, precise way he had spoken to Price, as though issuing an order rather than making a request. She could not sleep that night. The wind rattled the old glass in its frame, and her mind kept circling back to the drowning boy, to the icy shock of the water, to the peculiar authority in a common labourer's voice that had made even Price hesitate, however briefly, before continuing his cruelty. Sometime past midnight, unable to lie still any longer, Meg pulled on a shawl and made her way down the servant stairs toward the estate's small library, hoping a book might finally quiet her restless thoughts. She noticed a light first, a thin gold line beneath the door of the estate office, the small room of the main hall where Price conducted the harbor's business and kept his ledgers under lock and key. Price himself, Meg knew from years of managing her aunt's own correspondence with the man, was a creature of rigid habit who never worked past supper and never touched a ledger without a glass of port at his elbow. This late-night light was wrong in a way that made her pulse quicken. She crept closer, some instinct keeping her steps silent on the old floorboards, and peered through the narrow gap where the door stood slightly ajar. A man stood at Price's desk by the light of a single shielded candle, moving with quick, methodical purpose through a stack of heavy ledgers, occasionally copying figures onto a separate sheet of paper with the economy of motion that spoke of long practice. It was a laborer from the harbor. He had changed out of his sodden work clothes into a plain but clean dark coat, and in the candlelight, without the mud and salt spray that had obscured him earlier, Meg could see his face properly for the first time. Sharp, angular features, dark hair still damp and pushed back from his forehead, and an expression of such focused, coiled intensity that she understood, with a sudden lurch of alarm, exactly what she was witnessing. "You are stealing from the estate," she said, stepping into the doorway before she could think better of it, her voice sharper than she intended in her fear. The man's head snapped up, and for one instant, something dangerous flickered across his features before he registered who stood in the doorway, and the tension in his shoulders eased, though only slightly. "I am not stealing," he said. "I am reading. There is a considerable difference, Miss Ellery, though I confess the hour makes a distinction easy to doubt. You know my name. The village knows the story of the woman who waded into the sea for a stranger's son," he said. "It is not a large village, and I imagine it will not remain a small story for long." He closed the ledger in front of him with careful precision, though he did not move to hide the papers he had been copying figures onto. "You should return to your bed before someone find you standing in a dark hallway with a man who is, by every visible measure, breaking into a locked office in the dead of night." "And why should I do that, when you have just confirmed you are, in fact, breaking into a locked office in the dead of night?" Something that might almost have been amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Because, Miss Ellery, what I am doing in this room is considerably more likely to help the people of this village than to harm them, whatever it may look like from the doorway. Mr. Price's harbor accounts do not balance. I intend to discover precisely why, before another child nearly drowns for want of proper equipment his wages should have already purchased." Meg studied him for a long moment, weighing the strange authority in his bearing against the plain fact of a common laborer standing uninvited in a locked estate office at midnight, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. "The harbor master pockets a portion of every shipment tariff," she said slowly, the pieces she had half noticed over years of managing her aunt's correspondence suddenly aligning into a shape she had never quite let herself examine directly. "I have wondered, once or twice, why the repairs move so slowly when the estate's records show funds allocated for exactly this purpose." The laborious dark eyes sharpened with sudden, focused interest. "You have seen the allocation records." "My aunt corresponds regularly with the estate's London solicitors regarding her own modest interest in certain harbor investments," Meg said carefully. "I manage her correspondence. I have seen enough figures pass beneath my pen over the years to recognize when they do not add to what they owed." Something in the laborious expression shifted then, the wary calculation giving way to something closer to genuine, startled respect. "Then perhaps, Miss Ellery," he said slowly, "you and I have considerably more business to discuss than either of us realize standing in this doorway." They spoke for nearly an hour in that candlelit office, Meg producing from memory the general shape of figures she had transcribed for her aunt over the past 2 years, the laborer cross-referencing them against Price's own careful, damning records, until between them a picture emerged that left Meg genuinely breathless with the scale of it. Silas Price had been quietly diverting nearly a third of every harbor tariff and shipping fee for the better part of 4 years, funds that should have maintained the seawall long before the March storm ever arrived to expose its neglect, funds that could have paid the drowning boy's family a living wage rather than the pittance that had sent him out onto unstable stone in a rising tide in the first place. "You still have not told me who you are," Meg said finally, watching the strange laborer study the final column of figures with an intensity that seemed entirely disproportionate to a common workman's interest in his employer's ledgers. He looked up at her, and for a moment something almost like hesitation crossed his sharp features. "Would it change what you have told me tonight, if I did?" "No," Meg admitted, "but it would satisfy my considerable curiosity." A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Soon, Miss Ellery. I promise you an answer soon. For now, I would ask you to trust that my reasons for silence are not unkind ones." She did not press further, though the question followed her back up the servant stairs and into her narrow bed, where sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, threaded through with a memory of dark, searching eyes in candlelight. The days that followed brought a new energy to the harbor works that Meg watched from her cliff path with growing fascination. The laborer. She still did not know his name, though the other workers had begun calling him simply Alex in the rough, familiar way men address a trusted equal, began quietly organizing the crew with an efficiency that made Price visibly uneasy, redistributing tasks, insisting on proper safety ropes for the men working closest to the water, and, on one memorable afternoon that sent a ripple of gossip through the entire village, physically placing himself between Price's raised riding crop and a laborer who had dared to request an early end to the day's work as a storm gathered on the horizon. "You will not raise that crop again," Alex said, his voice carrying the same quiet, absolute authority Med had first noticed the day of the drowning, and something in his bearing in that moment, the utter fearlessness of a man who has never once questioned his right to give an order, finally crystallized into a suspicion Med had been circling for days without quite allowing herself to name it directly. Price, red-faced and trembling with a fury he clearly did not know how to properly direct, lowered the crop but did not retreat. "You forget your place, laborer," he spat. "I have the authority of his grace behind me. You have nothing but a strong back and a loud mouth. You have the authority of a duke who has never once set foot on this land to see what you have done with it," Alex said, and something in the stillness of the crowd gathered around them told Meg, watching from the cliff path with her heart suddenly hammering, that everyone present understood, in that moment, that something significant was about to happen. And what would a common laborer know of what a duke has or has not seen? Price sneered, though something in his voice had begun to waver. Alex reached into the collar of his rough shirt and drew out a heavy chain Meg had not noticed him wearing before, at the end of which hung a solid gold signet ring, its crest catching the gray afternoon light. He held it up, not for Price alone, but for the entire assembled crew and the small cluster of village onlookers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "I would know a great deal about it," Alex said, his voice dropping into a register that had shed every trace of the rough laboring accent he had worn for the better part of 2 weeks, replaced by something crisp, cultured, and utterly unmistakable in its authority. "Since I am that duke, Mr. Price, and I have spent the last 14 days digging stone beside these men specifically to see, with my own eyes, exactly what kind of steward I inherited along with this harbor." The silence that followed was absolute. Meg, standing frozen on the cliff path above, felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, understanding in a single dizzying instant that the laborer she had pulled from the surf, the man she had spoken with by candlelight, the man whose name she had wondered about for 2 restless nights, was not a laborer at all, but Alexander Vane, Duke of Ravensmere, master of the very house in which she had spent 6 years quietly making herself invisible. Price's face drained of every trace of color. Your grace," he stammered, the riding crop slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers into the mud. I had no notion." "That is precisely the problem," Alex said coldly. "You had no notion because you never once considered that the people whose lives you were grinding down for your own profit might matter enough to warrant caution. I have spent 2 weeks reading your ledgers by candlelight, Mr. Price, and I have documented every diverted shilling with a precision I doubt you believed any duke capable of. You will not see another day's employment on this estate, and you will count yourself fortunate if the magistrate proves half so patient with your explanations as I have just been." 2 of the fishermen, understanding at last exactly what authority now stood before them, moved to restrain Price, though the harbour master offered no resistance beyond a stun, muttering disbelief as he was led away toward the village constable's small house. The crowd that remained stood in a stunned, murmuring silence, until Alex turned to address them directly, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "Every wage Price withheld will be paid in full, with interest for the delay," he said. "The seawall will be rebuilt properly, with funds I will personally oversee rather than delegate to another man's discretion. And any family who lost a boat or a home in the March storm will receive compensation sufficient to rebuild beginning this week." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled villagers with something that looked, to Meg's eyes, very much like genuine shame. "I should have come sooner. I should not have needed a drowning boy to teach me what my own steward had made of this place. That failure is mine, and I intend to spend considerably more than 14 days correcting it." News of the Duke of Ravensmere's true identity and the manner of Price's downfall reached Blackwater House within the hour, carried by a breathless housemaid who had heard it second-hand from a fisherman's wife. Lady Prudence, who had spent the intervening days privately fretting over her niece's damaged reputation, found herself instead thrown into a frenzy of an entirely different character, one that made Meg, watching her aunt's transformation from icy disapproval to fawning anticipation, feel a fresh wave of the same weary cynicism that had defined so much of her adult life among people who value position over character. "You spoke with him," Lady Prudence said that evening, gripping Meg's wrist with unusual urgency. "You pulled his own labor, his own self, from the sea with your bare hands. Margaret, do you understand what this means? He will surely wish to thank the household properly. We must have him to dinner. We must." "I do not believe His Grace is much interested in dinners, Aunt," Meg said quietly, though privately she found herself wondering, with a flutter of something she did not entirely wish to examine, whether that was strictly true. She did not have long to wonder. Alex. She found she could not easily think of him as His Grace, not after 2 weeks of watching him hold stone and defend a beaten boy with his bare hands. Called at Blackwater House the following afternoon, and Lady Prudence, transformed overnight into a woman of extravagant hospitality, ushered him into the drawing-room with a fluttering deference that made Meg's stomach turn with second-hand embarrassment. He did not stay for the elaborate tea Lady Prudence had hastily assembled, though she pressed him with a determination that bordered on desperation, rearranging the good china twice and dismissing 3 separate housemaids for imagined failures in the biscuit arrangement before Alex finally, gently, declined her hospitality altogether. He asked, instead, with a directness that clearly startled her aunt into stunned silence, whether Miss Ellery might walk with him along the cliff path, as he wished to discuss a matter of estate business regarding her evident skill with accounts. Lady Prudence, caught between propriety and a sudden desperate eagerness to please a duke, could hardly refuse, and within minutes Meg found herself walking beside Alex along the same windswept cliff path where she had first watched him dive into the freezing surf, the grey sea stretching out beside them toward a horizon still faintly scarred with the wreckage of the March storm. "You did not tell me," Meg said, once they had walked far enough that the house had shrunk to a grey smudge behind them, "that you intended your confession to be quite so public." "I did not entirely plan it," Alex admitted, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth. "I intended to gather sufficient evidence and remove Price quietly through the proper legal channels, without the drama of a public unmasking on the beach. But watching him raise that crop again, after everything else I had already seen him do to these people, I found I no longer had much patience left for quiet channels. The village will speak of nothing else for a year," Meg said, though there was no real censure in it. "Let them," Alex said. "I find I have grown rather fond of being spoken of honestly, after 14 days of being invisible in exactly the way, I think, you have spent a great many years being invisible yourself." He glanced sideways at her, something searching in his expression. "The men told me your name before I ever learned it from you directly. The woman who waded into the sea for a stranger's son, and did not once pause to consider what it might cost her standing in the house above. I confess I have thought of very little else since." Meg felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold wind off the water. "It was not courage, Your Grace. It was simply that I could not stand on that cliff and watch a child drown while everyone around me worried more for their dinner than his life. "Alex," he corrected softly. "Please. I have had quite enough formality to last a lifetime, delivered in exactly the tone your aunt has been using at me for the better part of an hour." Something in the easy, private request loosened a knot in Meg's chest that had been tightly wound since childhood, since the first cold winter after her father's ruin taught her exactly how little her presence in any room actually mattered to the people occupying it. "Alex," she said, testing the name, finding it fit more easily on her tongue than she expected. "Then you must call me Meg. Everyone who matters to me already does." "Meg," he repeated, and something in the warmth of his voice saying it made her breath catch in a way she was entirely unprepared for. They walked on in silence for a while after that, the wind tugging at Meg's bonnet and Alex's dark hair alike, the grey sea rolling steadily beside them, and Meg found herself acutely, almost painfully aware of the small distance between their hands as they walked, wondering, with a flutter of something she had not permitted herself to feel in longer than she could remember, whether either of them might eventually find the courage to close it. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to the harbor and the village that Meg watched unfold with a satisfaction she had rarely felt in her adult life. Alex threw himself into the rebuilding effort with the same relentless energy he had shown as a disguised labourer, but now with the full resources of a dukedom behind him. Proper stonemasons brought in from Falmouth, a new harbour master hired on Meg's own recommendation, a fisherman named Josiah Trewin whose honesty was as well known in the village as Price's cruelty had been, and a systematic reworking of every tenant lease and fishing contract Price had twisted to his own advantage. Meg found herself drawn into the work more deeply than she had ever expected, her years of quietly managing her aunt's correspondence proving unexpectedly valuable when Alex, only half-joking, asked whether she might be persuaded to review the estate's new accounts before they were finalized. What began as a single afternoon's assistance became, within a fortnight, something closer to a formal arrangement, Meg spending her mornings in the estate office that had once been Price's private domain, now transformed into a bright, orderly room where she cross-referenced tariffs and wages with the same sharp, exacting attention she had once been forced to hide beneath the mask of a dutiful, invisible companion. The work suited her in a way she had not anticipated. She found genuine satisfaction in tracing a discrepancy back to its source, in drafting fairer lease terms for tenant farmers who had spent years under Price's exploitative arrangements, in watching the harbor's book slowly transform from a document of quiet theft into an honest record of a community rebuilding itself. Josiah Trewin, the new harbor master, took to consulting her directly on matters of wages and supply costs, at first with a careful deference due a duke's guest, and increasingly, as the weeks passed, with a plain, easy respect of a colleague who had learned to trust her judgment. Village wives who had once regarded the manor house with wary suspicion began stopping Meg on the cliff path to ask after fair prices for mended nets or the proper wage for a day's stone-hauling, until Meg realized, with a startled pride she had never expected to feel, that she had become someone the village genuinely trusted, rather than merely someone they were required to tolerate. Lady Prudence, initially delighted by the arrangement for the social cachet it lent her household, grew increasingly uneasy as the weeks wore on, and it became clear that the Duke's visits to Blackwater House had far less to do with estate business than either woman had originally pretended. Alex called nearly every afternoon, ostensibly to review figures with Meg, though their conversations wandered further from ledgers with each visit, toward the village's history, toward Meg's father's ruined shipping ventures, toward Alex's own guilt over the uncle whose neglect he had inherited along with the title. "I never wanted this life," Alex admitted to her one gray afternoon, the two of them walking the newly repaired harbor wall as workmen set the final stones into place around them. "My uncle groomed my cousin for the title, not me. I spent my childhood in the shadows of a family that considered me a spare, useful only in the unlikely event that tragedy required it." He paused, looking out over the water where 2 fishing boats, newly repaired, bobbed at anchor for the first time since the storm. Tragedy obliged, as it turned out. My cousin died of a fever 3 years before my uncle himself passed, and suddenly I was the only heir left, entirely unprepared for the responsibility, and honestly rather resentful of it, until I arrived here and understood exactly what neglect like my uncle's actually cost the people beneath it. You could have stayed in London, Meg said. Sent instructions by letter, the way I imagine most dukes manage their less fashionable properties. I could have, Alex agreed. I very nearly did. But something in Price's reports felt wrong to me, too smooth, too reassuring, the kind of report a man writes when he has something to hide rather than something to show. I did not expect, when I boarded that mail coach in disguise, to find quite so much wrong, nor to find quite so much right in the people I met while uncovering it. He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression that made Meg's pulse quicken despite the cold wind off the water. I did not expect to find you, Meg, a woman the entire county had apparently decided was unremarkable, who turned out to be the sharpest, bravest person I have encountered in a lifetime spent among people who valued neither quality nearly enough. Meg looked away, toward the repaired seawall and the boats bobbing gently at anchor, unable to hold the intensity of his gaze without her composure fracturing entirely. You flatter a poor relation too easily, Your Grace. Alex, he corrected again, gently, and I do not flatter. I have never been much good at flattery. Ask anyone who endured my company in a London ballroom before all this. I simply tell you what I see, which is a woman who has spent her entire life being told she does not matter by people who were never worthy of judging the question in the first place. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, walking the length of the new wall together as the pale spring sun broke briefly through the clouds, and Meg found herself thinking, with a kind of cautious wonder she had not permitted herself in longer than she could remember, that perhaps invisibility was not, after all, the only freedom worth having. That fragile happiness did not go unchallenged for long. Word of the Duke of Ravensmere's unconventional behavior, living for weeks among his own labours, publicly humiliating his steward, and now spending the better part of every afternoon in the company of his neighbour's plain, penniless niece, had begun to travel well beyond the boundaries of the small Cornish village, carried by letters and gossip until it reached London drawing-rooms Meg had never once set foot in and never expected to. Lady Prudence received, within a month, a flurry of correspondence from more fashionable acquaintances, each letter addressed in polite concern that barely concealed its real purpose, warning her that her niece's growing intimacy with the Duke, however flattering it might currently feel, was far more likely to end in ruin than in marriage, and that Lady Prudence would do well to curtail the arrangement before Meg's reputation, already fragile, collapse entirely. They say he is merely amusing himself, Lady Prudence told Meg one evening, the letters spread across her lap like a hand of cards she did not know how to play. That a duke does not marry a companion with no fortune, however useful she has made herself with his ledgers. They say when the novelty wears thin, he will return to London and forget your name within the season, and you will be left here, ruined by association, with nothing to show for it. Meg felt the old, familiar cold settle into her chest, the same bleak arithmetic she had lived by for 6 years reasserting itself despite everything the last month had taught her to hope for. Perhaps they are right, Aunt. Perhaps, Lady Prudence agreed, though something in her tone had softened, unexpectedly, into something closer to genuine concern than mere social calculation. But I have watched you these past weeks, Margaret, more alive and more yourself than I have seen you in the 6 years you have lived under my roof. I do not know what to make of a duke who prefers ledges and cliff walks to a woman's fortune or family name, but I find I cannot entirely bring myself to warn you away from whatever this has become, whatever the London gossips claimed to know of his intentions. It was Silas Price, awaiting trial in the County Gaol on charges of embezzlement, who provided the next and most dangerous complication. Word reached Blackwater House that Price, desperate to avoid transportation or worse, had begun spreading his own version of events among anyone willing to listen, a version in which the new Duke's 14 days of disguised labor were recast not as diligent investigation, but as evidence of instability, a man too unbalanced by his uncle's neglect to be trusted with the responsibilities of his title, and in which Meg herself featured as a scheming companion who had somehow orchestrated the entire unmasking to trap a Duke into an advantageous match. The rumor found fertile ground among several of Alex's more distant relations, who had never much cared for the estate at Ravensmere, but cared a great deal about the possibility of an unsuitable duchess diminishing the family standing. A cousin of Alex's late uncle, a sharp-tongued dowager named Lady Verity Ashcombe, arrived at Blackwater House unannounced one blustery afternoon, ostensibly to pay a neighbourly call but transparently to assess, and if possible dismantle, whatever attachment had formed between the Duke and Lady Prudence's niece. "You must understand, Miss Ellery," Lady Ashcombe said, settling into the drawing-room with the proprietary comfort of a woman accustomed to rearranging other people's lives to her satisfaction, "that Alexander has always been prone to sudden, ungovernable enthusiasms. As a boy, he once insisted for an entire summer that he intended to run away to sea rather than inherit anything at all. This harbour business, this laboring disguise, this sudden fascination with a companion of no particular fortune, I have seen this pattern before, my dear, and I promise you it does not end in a wedding. It ends in a very quiet, very final disappointment. Once the novelty has run its course and London's actual demands reassert themselves." Meg listened to the entire performance with the same still, careful composure she had spent years perfecting in rooms where she was not meant to have opinions of her own, and found, when Lady Ashcombe finally paused for breath, that she had very little patience left for pretending otherwise. "I have watched his Grace work a shovel until his hands bled to save wages he had never once needed for himself," Meg said quietly. "I have watched him stand between a defenceless boy and a raised whip without a moment's hesitation for his own safety. I do not know what pattern you believe you are observing, Lady Ashcombe, but I have found nothing in these past weeks that resembles a passing enthusiasm. If His Grace's family finds his character disappointing, I would gently suggest the fault lies rather more in the family's expectations than in the man himself." Lady Ashcombe's composure flickered, just slightly, though she recovered it quickly enough to deliver one final, pointed warning before taking her leave. "Bold words, Miss Ellery, for a woman with no fortune and no name to fall back upon, should this romance prove exactly as fleeting as I expect it to." The words followed Meg long after Lady Ashcombe's carriage had disappeared down the drive, settling into the same old wound they were clearly designed to reopen, the wound of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being reminded, in one form or another, exactly how little she was worth in the calculations that govern polite society. She did not mention the visit to Alex when he called the following afternoon, though something in her manner must have betrayed her, because he stopped their walk along the cliff path part way through and turned to study her face with quiet, focused concern. "Something has troubled you," he said. "Tell me." Meg hesitated, then found, to her own surprise, that she did not wish to hide it from him. "Your cousin, Lady Ashcombe, called yesterday. She was kind enough to explain, at some length, exactly why this, whatever this is, between us is destined to end in my quiet ruin rather than anything resembling a genuine future. Something dark and immediate crossed Alex's face. Verity has always mistaken cruelty for wisdom, he said. I will speak with her. Do not trouble yourself on my account, Meg said, though her voice wavered slightly despite her best efforts. She is not entirely wrong to wonder at it, Alex. I have no fortune. I have no name that means anything beyond this small corner of Cornwall. Whatever affection has grown between us these past weeks, I understand well enough what the wider world will make of it, whatever your own intentions might currently be. Alex reached for her hands, holding them steady between his own despite the cold wind whipping at both their coats. Then let me be entirely plain about my intentions, Meg, so that neither Verity nor anyone else in London ever has cause to make you doubt them again. He did not say more that afternoon, though something in the resolve of his expression stayed with Meg for the following 3 days, during which he did not call at Blackwater House at all, an absence that left her equal parts anxious and, despite her best efforts, quietly hopeful in a way she scarcely trusted herself to name. On the 4th morning, a note arrived by messenger, written in Alex's own economical hand, asking her to meet him at the old lighthouse at the harbour's edge at dawn, before the village woke and before, he wrote, either of them could talk themselves out of whatever conversation still remained unfinished between them. Meg woke before first light, dressing quietly so as not to disturb the household, and made her way down the cliff path in the pale grey hour before sunrise, the sea calm and silver beneath the sky just beginning to soften from black toward violet at its edges. The lighthouse stood at the harbour's furthest point, newly repaired along with everything else Alex had rebuilt in the weeks since Price's downfall, its lamp dark now that dawn approached, its narrow gallery empty save for the tall, familiar figure waiting there when Meg finally climbed the last of the spiral stays. You came, Alex said, something like relief evident in his voice despite its quiet register. You asked, Meg said simply, though her heart was beating hard enough that she suspected he could hear it even across the narrow gallery. He crossed to her, the wind pulling at his dark hair, and for a moment simply looked at her with an intensity that made the cold morning air feel entirely beside the point. I have spent 3 days in London, he said. Not for pleasure, I promise you, and not to escape whatever conversation Verity's visit stirred up between us. I went to settle certain matters with my solicitors and with my family, so that when I finally said what I intend to say to you this morning, there would be no doubt remaining of my seriousness, and no ambiguity for anyone in London to exploit against you afterward. Meg's breath caught. What matters? The full weight of my intentions, Alex said, reaching into his coat and drawing out a small iron key on a plain leather cord, holding it out to her with a steadiness that belied the evident emotion beneath it. This opens a harbour master's strong box, where the estate's tariff records and reserve fund are kept. I have already instructed my solicitors to add your name alongside mine as joint administrator of the harbour's finances, regardless of whatever else you decide this morning, because I have watched you manage these accounts with more integrity and skill than any man Price ever employed, and I will not have that go unrecognized simply because society cannot conceive of a woman deserving such trust. Meg took the key, turning it over in her cold fingers, too overwhelmed to immediately find words. But that is not the whole of what I travelled to London to settle, Alex continued, and something in his voice had gone rougher, less composed in his usual careful authority. I also settled, quite formally, quite irrevocably, my intention to marry you, Meg Ellery, regardless of what my cousin or anyone else in that city believes a duke owes his name. I do not offer you a fortune I already possess in abundance, nor a title that has brought me considerably more grief than glory since I inherited it. I offer you a harbor we have rebuilt together, a village that has come to trust your judgment as much as my own, and a life in which you are never again required to make yourself invisible for anyone's comfort but your own." He knelt then on the cold stone floor of the lighthouse gallery, taking both her hands in his. "I love you, Meg. Not the idea of you, not the story London will eventually tell about a duke and his companion, but you, precisely as you are, sharp-tongued and cautious and fiercely, stubbornly kind in exactly the moments when kindness costs the most. Will you marry me?" Meg looked down at him, at the man she had first seen collapse with exhaustion in a storm-battered trench, at the same dark, searching eyes that had watched her from the surf with startled recognition, and found that the cynical armor she had built over 6 years of careful invisibility had, at some point during this strange, stormy spring, simply ceased to serve any purpose at all. "Yes," she said, and then, because a single word seemed entirely insufficient for the enormity of what she felt, "Yes, Alex. 1,000 times yes." He rose and kissed her then, there in the gallery of the lighthouse he had rebuilt with his own hands, the first pale light of dawn breaking over the water below them, gilding the newly repaired sea-wall and the fishing boats bobbing gently at anchor, a village slowly waking to a morning neither of them would ever entirely forget. The wedding, when it finally took place that autumn, was not the grand London affair Lady Ashcombe and her circle had clearly expected and quietly dreaded. Alex insisted, over the faint protest of a handful of distant relations, on holding the ceremony at the small stone church overlooking the harbour itself, filled not with fashionable London society but with the fishermen, stonemasons, and village families who had watched the entire strange, storm-tossed courtship unfold from its very first freezing afternoon in the south. He did not say more that afternoon, though something in the resolve of his expression stayed with Meg for the following 3 days, during which he did not call at Blackwater House at all, an absence that left her equal parts anxious and, despite her best efforts, quietly hopeful in a way she scarcely trusted herself to name. On the 4th morning, a note arrived by messenger, written in Alex's own economical hand, asking her to meet him at the old lighthouse at the harbour's edge at dawn, before the village woke and before, he wrote, either of them could talk themselves out of whatever conversation still remained unfinished between them. Meg woke before first light, dressing quietly so as not to disturb the household, and made her way down the cliff path in the pale grey hour before sunrise, the sea calm and silver beneath the sky just beginning to soften from black toward violet at its edges. The lighthouse stood at the harbour's furthest point, newly repaired along with everything else Alex had rebuilt in the week since Price's downfall, its lamp dark now that dawn approached, its narrow gallery empty save for the tall, familiar figure waiting there when Meg finally climbed the last of the spiral stairs. "You came," Alex said, something like relief evident in his voice despite its quiet register. "You asked," Meg said simply, though her heart was beating hard enough that she suspected he could hear it even across the narrow gallery. He crossed to her, the wind pulling at his dark hair, and for a moment simply looked at her with an intensity that made the cold morning air feel entirely beside the point. "I have spent 3 days in London," he said. "Not for pleasure, I promise you, and not to escape whatever conversation Verity's visit stirred up between us. I went to settle certain matters with my solicitors and with my family, so that when I finally said what I intend to say to you this morning, there would be no doubt remaining of my seriousness, and no ambiguity for anyone in London to exploit against you afterward. Meg's breath caught. What matters? The full weight of my intentions, Alex said, reaching into his coat and drawing out a small iron key on a plain leather cord, holding it out to her with a steadiness that belied the evident emotion beneath it. This opens a harbour master's strong box, where the estate's tariff records and reserve funds are kept. I have already instructed my solicitors to add your name alongside mine as joint administrator of the harbour's finances, regardless of whatever else you decide this morning, because I have watched you manage these accounts with more integrity and skill than any man Price ever employed, and I will not have that go unrecognized simply because society cannot conceive of a woman deserving such trust. Meg took the key, turning it over in her cold fingers, too overwhelmed to immediately find words. But that is not the whole of what I travelled to London to settle, Alex continued, and something in his voice had gone rougher, less composed than his usual careful authority. I also settled, quite formally, quite irrevocably, my intention to marry you, Meg Ellery, regardless of what my cousin or anyone else in that city believes a duke owes his name. I do not offer you a fortune I already possess in abundance, nor a title that has brought me considerably more grief than glory since I inherited it. I offer you a harbour we have rebuilt together, a village that has come to trust your judgment as much as my own, and a life in which you are never again required to make yourself invisible for anyone's comfort but your own. He knelt then, on the cold stone floor of the lighthouse gallery, taking both her hands in his. I love you, Meg, not the idea of you, not the story London will eventually tell about a duke and his companion, but you, precisely as you are, sharp-tongued and cautious and fiercely, stubbornly kind in exactly the moments when kindness costs the most. Will you marry me? Meg looked down at him, at the man she had first seen collapse with exhaustion in the storm-battered trench, at the same dark, searching eyes that had watched her from the surf with startled recognition, and found that the cynical armor she had built over 6 years of careful invisibility had, at some point during this strange, stormy spring, simply ceased to serve any purpose at all. Yes, she said, and then, because a single word seemed entirely insufficient for the enormity of what she felt, yes, Alex. 1,000 times yes. He rose and kissed her then. There in the gallery of the lighthouse he had rebuilt with his own hands, the first pale light of dawn breaking over the water below them, gilding the newly repaired sea-wall and the fishing boats bobbing gently at anchor, a village slowly waking to a morning neither of them would ever entirely forget. The wedding, when it finally took place that autumn, was not the grand London affair Lady Ashcombe and her circle had clearly expected and quietly dreaded. Alex insisted, over the faint protest of a handful of distant relations, on holding the ceremony at the small stone church overlooking the harbour itself, filled not with fashionable London society but with the fishermen, stonemasons, and village families who had watched the entire strange, storm-tossed courtship unfold from its very first freezing afternoon in the south.